Sir Keir Starmer, we're going to have COP26 before the end of the year. What does Labour want to see coming out of what is a historic event?
It is a really important historic event, and what we want to see coming out of it is an answer to the question of how we get to the 1.5 degrees that was the ambition in the Paris conference. The Paris conference, in a way, told us what we needed to do. We know we're way off target. What Glasgow has to answer is, how do we get there? It's such an important moment, and the eyes of the world are on the UK, and they're looking at leadership here. But I can't emphasise enough just how important it is that we get that outcome in the Glasgow COP in just a few months' time.
Now, you've talked in terms of a definitive timetable in terms of winding down oil and gas production. Now, in the northeast of Scotland, this is a key industry.
Yeah.
It drives tens of thousands of jobs. Is there a danger that if you make your timetable too tight, that you're going to find that communities are left behind if these communities rely on highly skilled and highly paid jobs?
Any timetable has to involve those communities, those workforces, and the trade unions, including the GMB. That is why I'm raising it now, because what happened a generation ago under a Conservative government when it came to coal mining was there was no transition that was fair, there was no strategy, and then you had an abrupt end and the hollowing out of communities. We cannot allow that to happen anywhere in the UK. We cannot allow that to happen in the northeast of Scotland. We owe it to those communities to have that conversation now and to involve them in it. And we shouldn't just see climate change and the crisis as an obligation and a burden. There's a real opportunity. Here we at Whiteley's wind farm, looking at, the incredible wind generation and the change that's gone on here. In the northeast of Scotland, we could be thinking in terms of hydrogen production. We could be thinking about offshore wind. I mean, the northeast of Scotland is the expert on offshore wind. None of that will happen if we don't have a strategic plan in place, and that needs to start now. So no timetable that doesn't carry with it the communities, the workforce and the trade unions. But a head-in-the-sand approach here is completely wrong-headed.
Now, you've got ambitions to be Prime Minister. You're unlikely to become Prime Minister unless Scottish Labour have a fundamental political and electoral revival. And yet, just a matter of weeks ago, and despite the fact the SNP had a difficult record to defend an election, Labour came third. Unless you build from Scotland, you're not going to get into Downing Street, are you?
There's no route to a Labour government that doesn't run through Scotland. It's why I'm working so closely with Anas, our Scottish Labour leader here. He's very clear that his task is to build the alternative to the SNP and to the Tories, and to set that out and to take us into that next general election along with me in much better shape than we were in recent years. He's beginning that work just as I've been doing the work coming out of the 2019 election. None of us, neither Anas or I, have pretended that we haven't got a mountain to climb. We have, but we're determined that we're going to climb it and that we're going to go into that election making the case for that Labour government that is so needed.
Most commentators would say here that Scottish politics is still stuck in the tram lines of the Constitution. And let me put a point to you that the reason why you're not making any progress is that historically, on the issue of constitutional change, Labour drove it. They drove it in the 1970s, they drove it in the 1980s. The Wilson-Callaghan government legislated not once but twice for an assembly. Labour helped set up the Constitutional Convention. A Labour government delivered in the Scottish Parliament. But you look at Labour in the last 20 years in Scotland and say, where are their ideas for constitutional change? You seem to simply be a defender of the constitutional status quo.
Well, look, I'm proud of what the Labour governments have done in the past in relation to constitutional issues and in relation to devolution. I think we should go further. The question we should be asking ourselves is, how can we have more power and influence in Scotland, in Wales, and actually in our regions?
So the status quo is not an option?
No, the status quo isn't an option. We've got to go further than
what
that.
What new powers under Labour might accrue to the Scottish Parliament?
There are powers such as employment rights, etc. But there's actually power beyond the Parliament into communities. But let me just address a separate point there, if I may, because that tramlines or that intense focus on the Constitution means that we're not concentrating, I think, on what are the priorities of the day. We're living through a pandemic, the like of which we've never seen before. We're not through it yet. And so the central focus has to be on the recovery from the pandemic, coupled with the climate crisis. Now, you've just been asking me about the northeast of Scotland. Here we are at Whiteleys. We've got, I think, 250 wind turbines just outside. Not one of them was built in Scotland. So there's been a huge missed opportunity to get ahead of the next generation of good quality jobs, and it's been missed in Scotland.
Well,
The idea that the SNP is a progressive party, when they've missed that opportunity, just won't work.
When we come out of the pandemic, the SNP will ensure that the constitutional question remains centre stage. So I want to ask you a question just as a simple matter of principle. Do you accept that people in Scotland have the right to choose the form of government that they want, and that they shouldn't need Westminster's permission to decide on the form of government that they want?
I think it is a question for the people of Scotland. That isn't a principle that any of us quarrel with.
You can't imprison a nation under legal rules because constitutional issues are reserved to Westminster. It has to be
a matter for the people of Scotland. I don't quarrel with that principle. What I am saying is that the priorities at the moment are the recovery from the pandemic and dealing with
crisis. Got that, but the problem is that they've re-elected a government that made a clear pledge, and the government have said that they will bring forward a piece of legislation to enable a second referendum on Scottish independence. Now, if, as you say, you've just told me, that you believe in the principle that people should choose the form of government that they want, it would be anti-democratic to stand in the way of that bill, would it not?
What I'm saying is that the priority has to be the recovery. That is uppermost in people's minds. And it was only a few weeks ago that every party going into that election said it should be the priority.
Should Westminster have the right to veto
Well, that's
a second
the current arrangement in Westminster. But stepping back from that...
But should they exercise that right?
Stepping back from that, the question about the future of Scotland is obviously a question for the Scottish people, but the point I'm making is a different one.
You don't want to give them the choice. Labour doesn't want to give them the choice.
That's not true. What Labour is saying
you're not going to allow a second referendum?
The priority at the moment is on the recovery. Every political party going into that general election, into the elections earlier this year, said the priority is got to be on recovery.
So if you agree with the principle, when would it be appropriate to allow the Scottish people to do as you believe, to allow them to have the form of government that they want? When would be appropriate for a second referendum?
When we have come through the recovery and started to grapple with some of the issues in relation to
within the lifetime of the Scottish Parliament? Within the lifetime of the Scottish Parliament?
Let me try and see this through the eyes of some of the communities we've just been talking about in the north.
I'm just looking for an answer. Is it going to be within the lifetime of this Parliament? You said once the pandemic's
over. I think that for the lifetime of this Parliament, we should be concentrating on recovery. But I'm frustrated that there is a burning issue, which is what is the future of those communities and those jobs in the northeast of Scotland, and nobody is addressing that. The SNP promised thousands of jobs in the wind sector. They've delivered about 1 in 20. And the constitutional issue is a way of diverting focus from some of the very real concerns that we have here in Scotland that affect people in their everyday lives and affect probably the next generation of jobs in places like the northeast of Scotland. And we have got a duty to make the case that the priority has to be there.
One final question. The SNP government will publish this bill. We're in uncharted legal territory here in terms of the courts perhaps having to adjudicate whether or not this legislation is intra or ultra vires. Do you believe that a government in the United Kingdom should take the Scottish government to court to strike down that bill?
I have never thought that politics should involve going to court. I think politics should be kept out of the courts, and I say that as a former lawyer. Politics should be fought in the political arena, and I'm sure that's where in the end it will be fought. But the political arena was one, the elections we've just run. In the end, every single party said the priority should be on the recovery. Well, get on with it. That is what this Parliament should be about.
Sir Keir Starmer, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.